name is Katie and a big warm welcome to Interconnected York's Story Circle. So what is a story circle? Well, it's when a group of people like you get together to listen to something at the same time, a shared experience. Interconnected, this story circle is all about sharing the life stories of our amazing older residents in this brilliant city of York. You don't have to do anything, just sit back, relax and enjoy, and hopefully at the end you might feel inspired to have a cup of tea and a chat about what you've just seen. And you can open the pack that I've sent in with some treats inside. For today's episode, I'm here on Marygate with the city at one end, the river at the other, and a whole host of historic buildings all around me. Let's have a look, shall we? So to start things off, we're going to listen to Maureen's story. Here's a picture of Maureen when we had the privilege of interviewing her last summer. Maureen is 80 years old and loving life. Today though, in a bid to get young people involved, Annie is going to be playing the part of Maureen. Here she is.
Hi!
And whilst you're listening, I've got another story circle made up of young people who we're going to be listening to. We think it's really important to pass on the experience and wisdom of our older generation. And let's face it, who doesn't love a story?
Hello! Hello! I'm Charlotte.
I'm Sam.
I'm Amber. I'm Daisy.
So, Maureen's story starts here with her earliest childhood memories on Earlsborough Terrace, and in particular, this house right here, number 10. Let's hear what Maureen had to say, shall we?
My life. Well, it started with me coming down the banisters. Never down the stairs. Always down the banisters. Big oak banisters with little acorn on the end to stop me from flying off. They're in a beautiful big house by the river. Views like you wouldn't believe. 3 stories. And we had the run of it. Me and my sisters, June and Joyce, sliding down the banisters, wheeling our Tyndall's pram around the yard, watching the rain and the thunder and lightning as it came down across the river from the attic windows. Big trees bending in the wind, and the rain pelting down on the water. And we had 2 toilets. 2. Unheard of. 2 toilets? Where do you live? They'd say. With me nanny, I'd say back. Nanny. Nanny and 2 toilets. I'd just shake my head at them. Haven't you got a nanny? Well, of course to me, nanny just meant gran. And everyone had one of those. My dad was off fighting in the war, you see. So we lived there with my nanny and granddad in that beautiful big house by the river. Me, my mum, June and Joyce. I remember when my dad came home from Germany. I was 5, but never met him before. This strange man standing in the sitting room with a big army haversack on his back. This is your dad, they said. Your dad. Didn't know what to think. Then all of a sudden, he put down his pack and pulled out bar after bar of chocolate, lining them all up on the rug by the fireplace. There must have been about 80, 90 bars, all saved up. And I thought, I love this man. I love him. It was instant, just like that. York being York, there were floods. In 1947, they were bad. That spring, the river came up and up. It came up over the bank where you walked, up over the garden, up the 3 steps to the front door and on into the house. In the end, the army came for us. I was 7. They lifted me up and carried me out, put me in the army boat. And there I sat, boat up to my chin, looking out. And it was everywhere. River. Everywhere it shouldn't be. Lehman Road, all river. Scarborough Bridge nearly covered. Lendal Bridge this close. Oh, I hated it. And the house was so full of river that we couldn't go back. We had to go and stay with a lady doctor who lived on Marygate. It was the first time that I realised people do things differently. This lady doctor was clever. She had an MG sports car. And if you were at the top of Marygate, she'd let you have a ride down to the bottom. Oh, she had a swing in a garden and side plates with all her meals. I remember cutting the bread into cubes to go in the soup. And we had plates underneath the bowls and serviettes and the side plates. I loved it. But like I said, it was the first time that I realised people do things differently. We stayed there for about a week until the water went down. Then we went home. Well, it was home, but everything had gone. Everything except the kitchen table. We had no clothes to wear. We went to York Art Gallery. Side doors, big blue double doors. And inside there was a mountain of clothes. There was this woman there, and she looked me up and down, sizing me up, deciding what would fit. I got a Liberty bodice. It had little rubber buttons on that fastened to a Scotch kilt skirt that I wore on my bottom half. I loved it. We all got clothes, but the watermarks remained on the table forever. All 4 legs marked by the river. Memory of our uninvited guest. Not long after, my dad went to work in the sugar beet factory on Boroughbridge Road. It was sugar beet in the winter and labouring in the summer. One day there was an accident. Sugar beet is sticky, you see, and my dad fell 30 feet into a tank of water. Broke his wrist. Had a scar here and there. His face was all black and blue. My mum went to visit him, and she walked straight past him, didn't recognise him. Poor Dad. My gran was a big figure for me growing up. She used to take me to the auctions. Don't fidget, she'd say. They'll think you're buying. Oh, I love the auctions. Don't fidget, she'd say. And then she'd buy a table or an ornament or a vase. She used to take me to these beautiful houses. I remember once sitting in this beautiful sitting room on Stockton Lane. She said, sit there, stay. I said, fine. I wasn't gonna move. A few seconds later, she came back with these 2 big bags full of clothing. One time, she got this big batch of black swimming costumes, with legs in, with arms in, made properly. Every little child on Marygate got one. Here, you have one, you have one. Can you imagine? We were like a load of little tadpoles running around Marygate, playing by the riverside. A load of little tadpoles. She was clever, was my grandma. Had her head screwed on. The war for me was sitting under the stairs in the linen basket. Legs in, arms in, tucked up all nice. My nan and grandad were there. and my mum with baby Joyce in her arms. It was hiding under the stairs and big barrage balloons going over Lendal Bridge. I stood in doorways for years afterwards, every time a plane went over. Stood still, facing the door. For years. Terrified I was. We were always hungry. Always after food. Oh, rationing was still on. We used to go to Bootham Park Hospital and sneak the apples from there. Oh, they were delicious. Like little pears. We'd collect them up and tuck them in the elastic legs of our knickers, then waddle home. Oh, and I remember the first time I ever saw a banana. A sailor came home from the war with a big bright stalk of yellow bananas. Handed them out. Didn't know what to do with one. I'd never seen one before, wouldn't know how to eat it. It just stood there, handed them out. Imagine seeing a banana for the very first time. My granddad was lovely. He used to work as a watchman on the railway. To get to the railway from Marygate, you just had to go up the bank, tip-tap across the railway line. There he was, in his shed, with his tin mug and his box with his dinner in. And he had a drawer full of coloured balls, every colour you could think of. He used to collect them up from the railway line. A drawer full of coloured balls. My teenage years were man of school and going to the pictures with Joyce. We were allowed to go on our own. We had a lot of freedom back then. You just went out and played and came back when it got dark. Different times. Though I had a lot of common sense, even as a child. 15, and I left school. I wanted to go to art college, but my dad said no. Women are for marriage and having children. That was the end of that. I went to Terry's as a messenger girl, collecting the mail and working the switchboard. We had fresh fruit and juice. Oh, I was in my element. Mr. Winspear used to send me up to the top floor where the fresh pineapples came in. I'd go down with a jug of juice. We'd have that with chocolate. Oh, it's delicious. But the other girl left and I couldn't do the job on my own, so I had to leave too. I went to Roundtrees with me mum and June. Then I was a carer, cleaner first, then catering, then a housekeeper. Bootham Hospital, Clifton Hospital. 350 beds to be made at one point. I learned to cook. I learned to sew. I made my son Gary a coat when he was 3. Wool, made from my finest dog-tooth check coat. I made my daughter Kay a dress and a coat for my sister's wedding. I'm practical. I make things. And I never give advice uninvited. I think it, but I don't speak it. Be nice. That's the only advice I ever really give my kids. I think having children was my finest hour. When I had my first son, I couldn't stop thanking everyone. Thank you. Thank you. I was 20. 23 when I had Kay. My last son, Michael, came 8 years later. Just beating him at Scrabble, actually. He's lovely. They all are. I love my kids. And my grandkids. I think I learned how much family matters young. You know, when I lived with my nanny and granddad in that beautiful big house by the river. The one with the oak banisters. I'm Maureen. I'm 80, and this is my story.
Wow, there were some amazing memories there. And some questions came to mind as I was listening that I'm going to ask to the young people, but I'm going to ask you too. So the first question is this. Maureen talks a lot about the river and the influence that it's had on her life. So my question to you is, what does the river in York mean to you? Ask the person in charge to pause the video here so you can talk about the river. And we'll meet back in a minute to hear what the young people say to that question. Great, so over to you guys. So what does the river in York mean to you? Let's start with you, Charlotte.
I remember a couple of years ago, we went down to the river and saw a man sailing down the river in a huge pumpkin. He was trying to break the record for the largest pumpkin boat. He only had one paddle though, so he kept going around in circles. I've got a photo.
Can you show us? Oh yeah, that is a big pumpkin. Thanks, Charlotte, that's great. What about you, Sam?
I feel that the River Ouse really makes up York, because I think York wouldn't be York without a river. And I think especially when Roman settlers came in, and then of course it was all industrialised, it was all done by this big massive river that runs right through the centre of the city. It's just sort of a part of York we couldn't live without. You know, we walk along it, we have, you know, ice cream boats along it. It's a wonderful part of York that draws a lot of people to there. I think it's just an incredibly fundamental part of York.
Well, that is a great answer. You should be an advertisement for York, Sam. That is wonderful. Thank you. What about you, Amber?
For me, I have a really vivid memory. A couple of years ago, I used to the river a lot in the summer. I used to sit down by the riverbank and watch the canoers go by and doing their practices. And I really enjoyed that because it was very peaceful.
Yeah, I see that a lot. They get a lot of canoers on the river, don't we? Yeah, taking it very seriously and working very hard. Yeah. Great, thank you, Amber. And what about you, Daisy?
My story is nothing compared to Charlotte's pumpkin story, but for me, thinking of the river just brings memories of cycling along it with my family and just the scenery around it, the trees along the riverbank. And also, there's always the question of, will the ice cream boat be there? And when you're cycling past, it's something quite special when you see the ice cream boat alongside the river.
Everybody loves the ice cream boat, don't they? Lovely. Oh, it's really nice to hear your thoughts, guys. Thank you. Okay, great. So, the next question is this. Do you think children now have more or less freedom than children had in the past? Do we expect different things from them? Do they play differently? So what about you guys? Do you think children now have more or less freedom than children of the past when Maureen was younger? Let's start with you, Sam, please.
Well, according to government guidelines, we don't have any freedom, which I sort of do think is weird, because especially now that we're this age and we want to go out and things like that, we just sort of can't. We have to get around things like this with Zoom. It's really just weird. So I don't think we have much freedom currently, but perhaps in the norm, a bit more so.
Very good point. Yeah, you've made that very current, Sam. Right now is very difficult. Yeah, what about you, Charlotte?
Well, expanding on what Sam said, all the restrictions now have not only impacted children our age, but if you think of kids who are 6, 7 or 8, they won't understand what's going on. They can't see their friends, they can't go to school. It's really trapped them at home. No other generation has really experienced this.
Go on then, Daisy, what do you think?
Well, I think that forgetting the pandemic situation now, I think in general, kids are quite a lot less free, because when Maureen was a child, there were barely any cars around the streets and her parents could just say, all right, you can go out and be back in time for tea. and she could just go out and not have to worry. My parents wouldn't have to worry about her. But I couldn't imagine that happening now because of all the dangers. Parents would like ask you, where are you going out? What are you doing? Who are you meeting? That sort of thing.
So you're much more managed now.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about you, Amber?
Well, I do agree with Daisy in like some sense, but I also disagree because sometimes when I go out, I'm coming home and it's kind of dark, but I see kids and they're like out at the park and they look like way younger than me, like 7, and sometimes they stay out there till midnight. So I think it really just like depends on who your parents are, because sometimes they can be quite strict and like, oh, you have to be home at certain times, and sometimes they just don't care and just let you roam.
Yeah, it's a good point that parents do dictate kind of what happens when you're young, don't they? Question number 3. What do you know about the air raids that took place in York in the 1940s? What was life like during the Second World War? So what about you guys? What do you know about the Second World War in York and the air raids of the 1940s? What do you think, Daisy?
I just can't imagine that children would have to go through that. Like, it seems crazy to me. It must have been so scary just hearing a siren go off and having to go into an air raid shelter and not knowing if your house was still going to be standing. It just seems insane to me that children have to go through that. I remember when we interviewed Iris, and she said that she still couldn't bear to be shut in now because of having to spend the night in air raid shelters. And that's just an example of like the long-term effects it would have had on these children and how it would have caused bad mental health.
What about you, Charlotte?
Yeah, but if you think back then, about all the trauma that would have caused, and that wasn't really thought about back then. Mental health wasn't as important then. So, for one, the trauma that it will have caused, and 2, how they'll have to deal with it almost alone. They won't really have had much support. Children all over the country will have been traumatised, dealing with the effects of the war and their own problems.
Yeah, that is really interesting. The whole mental health aspect of it and having to deal with that trauma. What about you, Sam?
Well, I know that a lot of places locally have been affected even to this day, not perhaps in a negative way, but there's a pub locally called the Flying Legends, which is named after an airstrip that is now a supermarket and new estates. And I know people who live in houses who have bomb shelters in their back garden, and it's really weird, but there's relics like that are just still here today. And one of my family members, who whenever we see, always gives us sweets, and I always wondered why, and apparently it's because they grew up not having many sweets, and so it just sort of gives a cause and effect on the World War, and it's just such a different life.
Yeah, so the effects of it are still affecting how people behave now. Great, thanks, Sam. What about you, Amber?
Yeah, I'm thinking people back then must have been so brave to go through that, especially kids. Because I think if this happened to me, like, it would have been so scary. And like, the fact that they went through that and they were like, maybe not okay at the end, but they like managed to get through, was like really brave of them.
Thanks, Amber, that's great. And one last question. York had 2 iconic chocolate factories for most of the 20th century. Did you work in either of them? Did you know anyone who did? What does York's chocolate history mean to you? Okay, great. So the last question. What do you know about York's chocolate history? Let's start with you, Amber.
Yeah, I know that near where we all live, there's a big chocolate factory. I think it's a Rowntree's one. And it's like, I feel like it's really important because it's just been like a staple in York, because chocolate's like very iconic in York, and sometimes in times of the year you can like smell the chocolate coming from the factory, and that's really nice, and I really like when that time of the year comes around.
Don't we all? Yeah. Thanks, Amber. What about you, Charlotte?
For me, the chocolate factory holds quite a memory about being younger. I don't know why, but in primary school, we always used to go swimming on Thursdays. We went to Yearsley Swimming Pool, which is just opposite the Nestle factory, and every week we would come out of swimming all really cold and having wet hair because we did it in the winter, and we would smell the chocolate from over the road at the factory. That's quite a big memory for me.
Oh yeah, coming out of swimming baths and smelling chocolate. That sounds great. What about you, Sam?
Well, from what I remember of what they taught us at primary school, a lot of York was built by Joseph Rowntree for his workers. You had the terraced house, and then branching out from that, you had slightly nicer houses, which were built for all the workers. And he was really nice, and he built the Rowntree Park and just places for his workers to live, and he took care of them, and it was big.
Yeah. Okay, and what about you, Daisy?
I find it really fascinating that chocolate making in York is part of my history, being born in York. And I always found it really interesting learning about all the good work that Joseph Rowntree did and how that all happened in York years ago. And also, my mum works in archiving at the University of York, and one time I went into her work and she took me down into all the old archives, and she showed me things like old Rowntree's chocolate wrappers and all different parts of the chocolate history of York, and that was just amazing. It was like taking a step into the past.
What a special thing to be able to do. Great, thanks guys. Okay, I've got one last question that I'd like to ask you, and this is about Maureen's story. What will you remember personally about what you learned from Maureen's life story? Let's hear from Sam.
Well, for a lot of Maureen's childhood, she was brought up without a father, which seems really quite weird for me because my dad's so substantial in sort of who I am, and that she has such distinct memories from meeting him and him bringing home a bunch of chocolate, and it's just... And to have grown up in that time period is amazing for me, and the memories that come from it, it's inspiring.
Great, thanks Sam. And Charlotte?
Thinking about everything that she had to go through makes me really grateful for what we're dealing with right now, because I know this pandemic, it's not ideal and it's awful, but if you think of how much danger Maureen is and how much she would have lived in fear, and it does really make you think about how much the world has changed and how lucky we are now compared to what she had.
Lovely, thanks Charlotte. And Amber?
For me, I really liked how in her story she worked really hard her whole life, and even when she went through such troubles as a child and she grew up in that time, she ended up being really successful and having a happy life. And I think for me that's just like a lesson we could all stick to, like no matter what, just keep going.
That is great, Amber, thank you so much. And what about you, Daisy?
This is kind of the same as what Charlotte was saying, but I feel like I've taken away from it. It's made me feel really grateful for what I have now, and thinking about what all the children, and not even just the children, what everybody would have had to go through back then, and having war rations and all that to deal with. It makes me grateful because it makes me realise I live in quite a luxurious life right now.
That has been great, guys, and I know Maureen will be absolutely delighted with those responses about what you've learned from her life. That will really make her smile, I'm sure. Thank you so much, guys. It's been so lovely getting all of your thoughts. You're amazing. What brilliant young people we have got in York. Thank you so much. Before we finish, we'd love to share a song with you that we've written about when Maureen was 7 years old and she got flooded. Remember when the army had to come and rescue her? It's sung by Hannah and Isla, who are both 11 years old, and it's called So Full of River.
Looking back at my big house childhood, so full of river. Love it, hate it, you couldn't escape it, so full of river. Watching the rain as the thunder crashed, lit up in the frame as the lightning flashed. Memories of flame and forever cast so far. Up over the bank and across the garden, so full of river. No knock at the door, no begging and calling, so full of river. It filled our houses, it wore our clothes, it flung us out, it stole the rain. Those forced to crouch in an army boat, so full, so full, so full of river, so full, so full of river, so full, so full of river, so full. Swimming suit kids all dressed in black, we were so full of river. A load of little tadpoles playing on the bank, we were so full of river. As I embark on that next stage, the watermarks will never fade. They shape the part the river plays, so full, so full, so full of river, so full, so full of river, so full, so full of river, so full, so full, so full of river, so full, so full of river, so full, so full of river, so full, so full, so full of river, so full, so full of river, so full, so full of river, so full.
Well, we've really enjoyed chatting, and I hope you have too. Now might be a good time to open the pack that I sent and see what's inside. Well, that is the end of this story circle. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you join us next time for another story. I wonder what that one will be about. But until then, thanks so much for joining us, and goodbye.
Tell me a story, I'll sing you a song. Together we'll make sense of where we belong. Sing it together, together we'll find your life is not so different from mine. Sharing the tears and sharing the laughter, we won't forget them. Rolling the years back, whatever comes after, we'll all feel better. Tell me a story, I'll sing you a song. Together we'll make sense of where we belong. Sing it together, together we'll find your